Coming up, the New York Football Giants wrap up another joint practice with the Detroit Lions. There's another set of fights breaking out for Big Blue. But beyond that, the first unofficial depth chart is revealed. Where are some of the key positions that we want to keep an eye on? And are there players on the bubble ready to get pushed out? We dive in live on YouTube coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that I am one of your hosts, Adam Armbrecht, healthy, wealthy, wise, ready to break down the continuing camp sessions for the New York Football Giants. We're going to talk a little bit about all the fights, and I'll try to offer what can be a positive going into this season, as a lot of fans and even some of the media around the team have suggested for this team, showing some scrap, showing some fight. But primarily, we want to get into the depth chart for the New York Football Giants, talk about where some of these position battles are going to unfold, talk about the wide receiver room and how that could shake out here, and whether or not we could see potential trades maybe even before the season gets underway. A rare thing typically around the NFL. Cuts happen, signings and free agency happen, obviously, but to get a trade, you need to find teams that are going to make a lot of sense as partners. And in that vein, as we're live on YouTube mentioning at the top, feel free to hop in on the comments and the concerns, quandaries, questions you may have. The Detroit Lions, we're going to be doing a crossover tomorrow with a great podcast that covers them as well from the UK, actually. And we're going to go ahead and put forth some trade opportunities and things that would improve a very high-level expectation team like the Detroit Lions, and also maybe help improve the Giants from an overall balanced roster standpoint. That being the case, Andy will be joining us this morning at some point. But before he does, let's talk about what's been going on inside of these joint practices. Obviously, yesterday, another chippy session. Malik Nabers is making catches all over the place, 18 targets, brought down 17 of them. He looks electric. He looks elite. And we'll go deeper on this before the season starts. But I said this when we initially drafted him and came in and had the conversation. What are expectations for him? I've seen, and I think I mentioned this last episode too, a number of fans coming out and saying, listen, with Daniel Jones play and the team is bad, you really can't set too high of a bar for Malik Nabers in his rookie year. I pointed to Darius Slayton. It's not a knock on him. It's a reality of who he is, a fifth-round player who had issues around drops, obviously, early in his career. Looks like maybe he's cleaned them up. We're going to talk about him when it comes to the depth chart. If a player like that over these last handful of seasons and last year specifically can give you 770 over 87 or 79 targets, that is going to make a massive difference when you go to the talent that is Malik Nabers. So 1,000-yard receptions are on the board here for him, obviously. I have him going for maybe 6 touchdowns, maybe even more. And then obviously we talk about receptions. I'm going 75. But we'll have a whole episode about that. He's in camp. He's scrapping. This particular instance, a couple of these are ones where he's making big plays, getting up and just kind of slapping at some of the Detroit Lions cornerbacks and being a little bit of an antagonist. And I'm cool with it because you are the 6th overall pick. You are an elite wide receiver talent, and you want to come in and set the tone that I have expectations. And by the way, I love that when he comes out after the session, he says it's just practice. We're here putting up the hype, right? Fans are getting excited. People are watching him play. And you can tell when a player steps out on the field in training camp, in these joint practices, there's always those couple of guys that are the elite talents of the NFL that jump off the screen at you. That's what Malik Nabers is doing right now. So, but he's doing the both and. He's been being a little bit of an antagonizer against the Lions. He's making big plays. He's probably irritating a lot of them as a rookie. He's hyping himself up. He's hyping Daniel Jones up. He's hyping the wide receiver room up. And then he's coming out after and saying, hey, listen, this is just practice. I'm just trying to get better. And it's about, progressing forward and getting ready for the regular season. So I love all the boxes that he's checking right now. On a high level, when we think about a team fighting in camp, I've heard now this narrative of that's what you want, right? This team's a little bit scrappy. They're mixing it up. They want to show what they're capable of. That's awesome. It really is. And I mean that sincerely. It's awesome to have that. What I will also tell you is that the only difference here is what it means when you get to the regular season. And to continue that part of the conversation, we'll go ahead. We'll get our other true blue hero in here, and that is one Andrew Makowitz. Andy, talking about, as we're live on YouTube, mentioned some of the positives coming out, talked about Malik a little bit. But in terms of this team being a scrappy, fighty team in camp, do you believe, Andrew Makowitz, that whether or not it's cool to see them scrapping and fighting and maybe showing a little bit more energy and vibe to them than they have in past preseasons and past training camps, there's a fine line that we'll find out in the regular season. Are you a chippy, fighty team because you're going to make every opponent grind out wins? Or are you a chippy, fighty team because sometimes you're getting blown out more often than not, and it kind of gets to the level of being annoyed or irritated that you're not getting across the line?
Well, listen, I don't think that any of the teams that have a proven track record of success need to do any of the chippiness. Like, if the Chiefs are doing a joint practice, do
Right.
they really need to do why are they getting chippy? Like, why? I don't want to see Patrick Mahomes anywhere near a scrum. I don't want to see anything. They've already proven that they have the ability to do what they need to do. However, for teams that are trying to come together as one, build an identity, figure out what they want to be, I think there are steps in the process that those teams need to take. Prime example, look at the Detroit Lions last year, right? They were considered scrappy, aggressive, fighting. They punched the Giants in the mouth during joint practices, and everyone was like, whoa, they are someone to look out for. So I do think there are steps in the process. The Giants were not a good team last year. They are not having high expectations for this year. So they really need to build an identity and gel together. And I think when you see, look, Brian Burns, Brian Dable, Joe Shane, everyone's like, we don't want to see Daniel Jones in there. But like, they're kind of smirking also because like they just know, like when guys are getting pushed around, they're just going to like push and shove a little bit. It kind of helps the camaraderie to see Daniel Jones do that. Like if he was a top 3 quarterback, I want him nowhere near the pile. But like he does need to ingratiate himself with Malik Nabers and some of the new offensive linemen. And so there is a little bit of like, I think this is needed by the Giants. But if they were a better team or had a track record of like been there, done that, then you don't want them to do this at all. So like I kind of go back and forth, but basically where the Giants are at them, I think this is okay and it's fine. And I really just hope that it helps the team gel together and say like, hey, we're going to fight and compete together. We're in this foxhole, but that still remains to be seen until week 1.
Talk about one of our frequent flyers, Side Guy Bry, coming in on it. I don't know what will come of this, but I feel way better what I'm seeing so far from this year to last year. And of course, that's what it is, right? You at least feel like the vibes are better. We'll see what it translates to. And my one last footnote on this before we focus in on this first unofficial depth chart that has come out. I think that the nice part about this would be that Brian Dable and his maybe over-aggressive sideline personality, I like if it's being transfused into the players on the field a little bit more, because then I think it creates the right hierarchy. You can be fired, you can be passionate as a coach, but you're supposed to be the guy in control. So guess what? You can be charging up your team, and then it's your job to rein them in. We heard these conversations with Malik Nabers on Hard Knocks, drafting him. Do you know when to dial it up, when to dial it back? And listen, when you're making big catches and slapping opposing cornerbacks on the side of the helmet as you run back to the huddle, I think it does feel a little bit calculated, like, hey, I'm just here to kind of get a little bit, mix it up a little, let people know that I'm here, and probably get under some skins in 1,000-degree heat these last couple of days. But last note before we move into depth chart.
Yeah, I just had one more note before we get into the depth chart.
Is it about Devin? I'm gonna do Devin Singletary again. Is it about Singletary? Absolutely. Like, I mean, we talk about scrums. Devin, I can't
Motor.
Can't do it. I can't do it, Andy. It's happened now. It's over. And we're live. There's no going back. Motor. Singletary. So when he looks like he's going to scrap, he looks like he's going to scrap. He doesn't look like a guy that's like, oh, I'll get in the mix and we'll all start hugging each other and then teammates will break him up. He did. Anyone familiar with the Mission Impossible series, he did the Henry Cavill double fist pump. Like, all right, if we're scrapping, we're scrapping. He was ready to go in that practice.
Well, that wasn't what I was going to go with, but what I will say is you also know the mark of a guy that knows how to scrap because as he's walking over, he put his mouthpiece in. Like he's been there before. Like he's like, this is what boxers do. This is what happens when you get in a fight. You may as well use the protection. What I was going to say is I thought license plate guy on Twitter /X had said, I'm now more confident in seeing Malik Nabers during training camp than the feigned excitement that I had for Darren Waller and the way that things were last offseason. Remember, the big acquisitions last year were we got John Michael Schmitz. He's a set it and forget it generational center. It's going to fix the offensive line. And guess what? We couldn't get a number 1 wide receiver, but I mean, Darren Waller is that guy. If only he stays healthy and if only he reverts back to what he was 2.5 years before he got all of these injuries. And so like you kind of squinted and said, yeah, we were going to be really good and you were confident. Now fast forward to this training camp, this joint practices, you see Malik Nabers dominating all over the field. He is living up to the hype. You see Illuminor at the right tackle, encouraging the way that he's been able to handle himself so far, especially in these joint practices. You start feeling like what you hoped last year would look like now with some of these new players. So for me, I think to that comment that you had just put up before, it does feel like there is a different level of excitement this year, and maybe more of a justified or warranted one than the one we had last offseason.
Yeah, I think last year might have been built on a little bit more the most optimistic version of things versus what this year feels like youth when it comes to some of the key draft picks, and then also experience, where we do feel like when you target these veterans, especially on the offensive line, you want to see that consistency, that production right out the gate. Let's talk unofficial depth chart coming up here in a second, though. Interesting position battles potentially. And listen, it's all just conjecture, but already you can start to see the way some things are shaking out. We'll get into that here in just one moment. All right, as we come live, Andy, over on YouTube, we remind you today's episode is brought to you by Pietential, Pietential, Pietential.com. It is an online wellness assessment tool. It's free for individual users. It sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve, and tracks your progress over time. It's a great way to make sure that you're carrying through an even keel baseline day to day, week to week, month to month, and year to year. Check out Pietential today. All right, Andy, we have up in front of us, if you're watching live over on YouTube, don't worry. If you're on the podcast feed, we'll be breaking it down verbally as well. Have the wide receiver, offensive line, running backs, quarterbacks, tight ends, the whole offensive side of the football up here. And we do it in two tiers. This is the front end of this rotation. And then we also have the back end of the roster, guys that we think are maybe bubble players. First thing that jumps out to me, I won't even ask you, is that when you see going to the wide receiver room, listen, it says or, but when you see Jalen Hyatt or Darius Slayton, it's conjecture, but this is the exact position that we talk about zeroing in on. And I do have a question when it comes to why the Giants might be more interested in putting Hyatt there, even beyond having been their draft pick. Do you believe what you've seen over these first couple of training camps and joint practices that Jalen Hyatt is closer to claiming that role than he is behind or on the heels of Darius Slayton?
Well, before you get into who's claiming what role, the first thing that stood out, if you go to the Giants website, they don't have or, they have a slash, and they have them both in the wide receiver starting.
That's why I go with this version, because it says or.
But yeah, but it's hilarious to me because you know how the conversation went inside the building, right? Like, yeah. I think we all know, like Joe Shane, Brian Dable, and Mike Kafka sat down and they're like, okay, well, we have to put like some kind of depth chart together, right? And like, we know Nabers is going to be starting because he's, our first round draft pick, top 5, top 6 pick. We know Wan'Dale Robinson is going to be locked into that slot position. They're like, so what do we do with that other one? Because like Jalen Hyatt is ascending. Darius Slayton is a proven veteran that has been our most consistent wide receiver. Like, what do we, what does it matter? Throw a slash, put an or, put an and put them as like co-starting wide receivers over there. So I thought that was funny. What I'm surprised about is how the tie doesn't go to Darius Slayton just like right out of the gate to say, we're going to give the veteran the nod and Jalen Hyatt has to earn it. It's almost like the Giants have this self-fulfilling prophecy of like, we need Jalen Hyatt to ascend, or we're going to have another one of our high top draft picks not performing, not contributing right out of the gate.
Yeah, I mean, listen, year number 2, obviously third round pick, certainly had some first round pedigree coming into the draft class, and he fell maybe mostly predicated around routes and whether or not he'd be able to do the full complement on the field. Here's the way that I'll take it. 1, he is their draft pick, so I do believe you want to kind of instill that confidence, and we're going to have that conversation when we get to the defensive side of the football too. But I think you want to instill the confidence so hey, listen, it's your position, right? Heard this about a little bit, some other spots across this roster. Your job to lose. I think they want to put Jalen Hyatt in a position of confidence. Also, I'll go the step further. I think that this would be directly related to how good Malik Nabers is looking right now. It's different if you're coming into the season, not unlike when you had Jalen Hyatt a year ago and gets taken in the third round. We understand that. But you're not sure. Is he ready? The route combinations are going to bring him on a little bit slowly. It's going to take him time. When you're seeing how good, and we've heard Dable and the Giants say, everything is earned, right? You play well in between Monday to Saturday, you get on the field on Sunday. But if you're looking at Malik Nabers and saying, this dude is going to come in and he's going to light the league up day one, I think it makes it easier to start to look at, already feel confident about Wan'Dale Robinson, but then to go the extra step and say, hey, Jalen Hyatt, man, this guy is going to be such a problem for defenses that you're going to have a real opportunity to feast very early in this season. And don't forget, he has the speed. Like, he is a burner and a more athletic burner relative to Darius Slayton, who did have speed coming into the league 5 years ago. So I just think it's like this combination of everything. How do we put the best version of our core on the field? I believe that Jalen Hyatt, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Malik Nabers represent the best, most dynamic, full version of a top 3 wide receiver, not necessarily accomplishments, and it's not taking anything away from Slayton.
Yeah, well, but if you had to win week 1 to get into the playoffs and you were figuring out who do you start, would you start Darius Slayton or would you start Jalen Hyatt?
Well, that's an interesting question, Andy, because I probably would at this moment start Darius Slayton because I feel like he can, make some of those plays. But again, talk to me last week of the preseason. I may have a different response. This is, right now on August 7th. This is where I stand. I love that I see him at the top of the list there in Hyatt.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That's a good point you bring up, though. That's a good,
but it's like who's more of a key contributor? I believe Darius Slayton is in the short term, but obviously in the longer term, you hope that Jalen Hyatt ascends to that. So the Giants kind of hedged their bets a little bit there. Okay. I'm curious to see how it continues to go through camp. But right now, I think Darius Slayton, if your life depended on it, he's the guy that starts for you. If my job was on the line and I had to win one game.
Sure. And I think a great example of this would be like if we flip it over, because let's talk about running back. I'm going beyond the offensive line here just because we spent so much time on that. When you go into the running back room, another great example of this would be if we turn it over to the back end of this. Well, do you want to start Tyrone Tracy Jr. or do you want to start Devin Singletary? We go, of course, Devin Singletary. The guy is so experienced. But by the time we get into this season and, midway through trade deadline time, not that anyone's going anywhere, but you might feel different about these players depending on where they are. Running back room, Eric Gray, unofficial depth chart, listed as the backup to Devin Singletary. Do you put anything in this beyond just, hey, it's early days, Tyrone Tracy Jr., Dante Miller? Like, that's the room. Corbin, tragically injured, cut. He's no longer with this roster, even though I think he gets listed somewhere along the way on this unofficial depth chart still. How do you feel about Eric Gray getting posted up there? Does that seem like anything to you or nothing?
It seems like what I expected to see in the wide receiver room, and that is rookies don't just get handed backup spots or starting spots unless you are Malik Nabers and you're all world. Like, if you are a mid-round draft pick, you need to earn it. Now, when we turn over to the defensive side of the ball, there'll be some interesting nuggets over there, but no one can convince me otherwise that Eric Gray is the number 2 running back. And in fact, based on what I saw last year, plus what we've seen so far this year in camp, the same question. If you had to win week 1, would you immediately insert Eric Gray behind Devin Singletary? Or would you be like, give me Tyrone Tracy with what he's done. Give me the upside of what Turbo Miller has with his speed. There's no way that if you were the offensive coordinator or the head coach, Adam, that if your job was on the line, you had to win one game, that Eric Gray is getting more snaps than either of the 2 guys that are listed behind it.
Well, no, but isn't that, but then, yeah, but that's, so you're going with quote unquote, you should be going with experience. Eric Gray is a 2nd-year player. He's not some rookie off the street, but now you're not going to trust him.
Who would be more productive in that one game?
Oh, no, of course, nobody knows. All we know about Eric Gray is that he may not be able to play running back. We don't know anything for certain. The other thing that I think I find interesting about, not to throw shade, by the way, I hope Eric Gray works out. Like, I hope that he does find a role here because we think about him being the North and South, potential there.
Adam, listen, that's pretty disparaging of you. He is an NFL player. He does work out. He is in the weight room. He is exercising. He is making sure to get himself fit. That is just besmirching an NFL player for your favorite team. I can confirm that Eric Gray works out 100%.
Listen, I could go to Planet Fitness, not a sponsor, but, doesn't make me an athlete, right? Anyway, point is, we'll see what happens there. And one of the things I think just in conjunction with the wide receiver room is obviously when we talk about right now, you see Tyrone Tracy Jr. and then Dante Miller in the running back room. Go back up to the wide receiver room. Listen, Miles Boykin, Gunnar Olszewski, who was, by the way, in one of these scrums here in this. You have Dennis Houston that's been getting some hype, but like a lot of names on the back end of it. And then even at the top end, Wan'Dale Robinson, then it's Isaiah McKenzie. Like, what happens in special teams and how these things get carved out? Like, everyone knows, reminder, Tyrone Tracy Jr., former wide receiver. And there's just this thing when we talk about flexibility and roles. I think Tyrone Tracy Jr., a way that he carves a role for himself is that, we can line you up a few different places and have you be an effective weapon for this offensive scheme. All right. Let's talk about offensive line before we get into the tight end room a little bit. That's also intriguing, but thing that has to jump out to everybody here. Obviously, we know that John Michael Schmidt's injury. They're using Van Roten all over the place. Aaron Stinnie on the first unofficial depth chart. It goes Andrew Thomas, John Runyon Jr., John Michael Schmitz. This all makes sense. Then Aaron Stinnie, and then Jermaine Illuminor. Are we supposed to, a guy in Aaron Stinnie that we know is on the team, everyone knows that, but has not been getting talked about at all. Van Roten, who comes in, and it just seems to be that there's this 1, 2, 3 process of if Evan Neal's injured, he's not going to be effective. Well, boom, 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 shift, and there you go. And instead, is this just because Van Roten just got in the building? Otherwise, are we actually led to maybe think, keep an eye on it, Van Roten may be the super depth across the interior of the offensive line in some version?
No, Van Roten is here to start. It's very simply he just hasn't been in the building long enough where it would just be a sign of disrespect to someone like Aaron Stinnie.
That was a test, Andy. You passed. Good job.
I passed the test. Perfect.
Yeah,
because you can't, I mean, think about how disparaging that is. A guy's been in the building, lifting weights, working hard, understanding what he needs to do. He's the guy that should be listed as the right guard. I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah.
Greg Van Roten has literally been here for 3 days, 4 days. And it's like, at some point, his veteran capabilities will allow him to move into that role, but you can't just hand it to him after he hasn't practiced at all. It would be sending a bad message, and that's the whole point about this, is these unofficial depth charts mean nothing, but they do mean something probably to the players, and it's like you have to give a nod in certain situations where it's like, Aaron Stinnie, you've been in the building, you've been working hard, we're going to give you that first pass, and guess what? If Aaron Stinnie, during all of these things, looks amazing, I could see him getting the job, right? Like you give it to him and you say, make someone else take it away from you. So I'm happy with how they handled the guard position.
Tell you what else is interesting while we're on the subject, right tackle. Joshua Ezeudu gets listed as the first backup behind Jermaine Illuminor. Now, we all understand that Evan Neal is injured, but you just kind of said it there. Hey, the depth chart unofficial may not matter in reality, but could matter to the players. Well, it might matter, one, to Joshua Ezeudu saying, hey, we believe that you can be a backup tackle for us. You're going to get reps there in camp, earn that job. And who knows, you have Kajus getting listed behind Andrew Thomas, but hey, one of these guys could be the swing tackle, obviously, if it comes down to roster positions. When you dial it back, though, then inside of that, right tackle has Joshua Miles also listed back there. Now, there's the injury list around this unofficial depth chart, but it's just, hey, man, I think it's just the old dose of reality about where the organization is, where the team is, and no one's going to knock this or beyond saying, hey, was it a bad pick when it comes to the draft class? But this is the reality. Who's going to claim a backup tackle role? Maybe Evan Neal comes back healthy. We hope that he does. I hope he finds a role on this team. But ultimately, he does not exist as far as we're concerned when we start to set the initial depth chart.
Well, so Adam, the one thing the Giants did highlight, they made sure to say it, is that anyone that is on the physically unable to perform list, which is always known as the PUP list, is not listed here. And thank goodness that's the case right now, because I have a serious question for you. If Evan Neal was activated today, where does he get put?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, you're going to put him at tackle. It's going to be right tackle. He's not changing positions to anything else. It's going to be right tackle. But again, as we've always talked about, if you're not good enough to start at the level of how much he was not able to start, how could you put him as the initial backup? It's why we scratched our heads last year when it was Matt Peart. We were like, why is he getting the backup swing tackle role? He proved that he can't be trusted either. So I don't know where you would put him. And I couldn't put him anywhere above third tier on the depth of this roster.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. We obviously saw Joshua Ezeudu get thrown into a really, really impossible situation last year with all the injuries. He did not look great. Maybe with a year of seasoning and a little bit more time to like build into that role,
of course,
he could be a backup swing tackle. But to that point, like, I don't know, like, Kajusti is fine as a backup depth chart piece now, but like, I'm genuinely curious if Evan Neal comes back. Do you almost say that he's the backup left tackle for Andrew Thomas and you try to just like have him solidify that position? Do you put him behind Illuminor at the right tackle and say you may be the swing tackle? Like, I'm genuinely curious.
Evan Neal?
Yeah, Evan Neal. Like, what
you want to bring Evan Neal back from being essentially a draft bust at right tackle and having injuries and not being able to be trusted, and you want to bring him back and say, let's plug him in behind Andrew Thomas and see if he can solidify as the swing tackle. Oh my goodness. I mean, you can give him the opportunity to do that, but he has to be behind a player at right tackle as the second. If it's a Zudu, it's a Zudu, and behind a player left tackle. There's no world that you can bring him back and plug him in behind Andrew Thomas and behind Illuminor and say, it's your job to lose as the backup swing tackle. Oh my goodness. I'd be shocked.
But so Adam, the reason why I'm saying that is because Illuminor hasn't really had any injury concerns. He's been fairly durable on the right side. And so, like, obviously it would be easy to say that Evan Neal could potentially back him up in the right tackle position.
Yeah, I get it.
If Andrew Thomas, who's had a few injuries in his career, he ends up getting hurt, who comes in at left tackle for him? Like, Ozudu.
I would put in Ozudu before I would put in Evan Neal at this point, based on performance. Ozudu, even as by the way, drafted as a guard and then moved to those positions, I have more confidence in the developmental upside of Ozudu right now than I do in the results-oriented things that I've seen from Evan Neal.
I mean,
and I'm not. And by the way, I'm not waving I'm not championing the flag of Joshua Ozudu being the hero of backup tackles.
Listen, I completely appreciate that. Joshua Ozudu had a 42.4 PFF grade last year. Evan Neal had a 39. We're really talking about like the lowest of the low. But Adam, also, Joshua Ozudu had 6 penalties and 5 sacks in his limited time out there. Evan Neal had 2 sacks and 5 penalties. So, like, I'm just saying, like Ozudu was a turnstile when he came in, and I don't blame him because he wasn't drafted to be in that spot. He played guard. My whole thing is like, again, if we needed to win week 1 and we had to put someone in, I would put Evan Neal in at left tackle over Ozudu because he was drafted for that. He has higher pedigree. You close your eyes and you hope. And
I'll go a different way. If the Giants needed to plug someone in, not named Andrew Thomas at left tackle, he's not on the roster right now. You would go out and you would get somebody. I'll tell you that right now. If that's what it came down to, having Evan Neal as the backup swing tackle, I guarantee you would see a roster move. Let's put a pin in it there for now. We've got a lot of offseason to talk about that, and it always happens. We cannot on OGP.
It's crazy that we talked the most about a guy that wasn't even listed on the unofficial depth chart more than the people that are official, but it is important because he is the guy that makes everyone have to move around on the first line of the depth chart. That's
you're seeing it right now. They brought in Van Roten because he couldn't play right tackle. And they had to move Illuminor and move Runyon and all these moving parts. Last note offensively here, just real quick. At the tight end position, it's Daniel Bellinger. It's Lawrence Cager getting listed there as the number 2 tight end before you go down into Chris Manhertz and then also Theo Johnson. I'm trying to remember, is Manhertz the older of the two? He is the older of the two between him and Stoll, right? I'm a little surprised by that. You remind me if Stoll has an injury right now, because if not, my expectation was based on both those players, him and Manhertz, being good blockers in both avenues of the game. I thought that Stoll would be the player based on age that you would see in this mix here. I'm not surprised at all with the injuries that Theo had, minor as they were, that he's listed last year on this depth chart, at least coming in.
Well, Jack Stoll is 26 years old. All the other guys are very young. Chris Manhertz has been around since 2015 when he was drafted by the Buffalo Bills. He is 32 years old. He is the only quote unquote like veteran adult in the room when you look at Bellinger, Cager, and Theo Johnson. So to me, it's kind of like a nod to like the older veteran that's probably helping guide them and teach them and learn them. I would be shocked if we went in week 1 and this was the depth chart. You would expect, with Theo Johnson getting a little bit of injury early and then coming back, he's going to have to work his way and earn his reps because Daniel Bellinger was good his rookie year. Then he was decent serving as a tight end number 2. It makes sense that he gets the starting nod. It's fine that Lawrence Cager is back at the number 2. I expect by week 4 that Theo Johnson is the tight end number 1 on this team, or at least you hope that's the case given his athletic upside.
Listen, I mean, Daniel Bellinger, all these rumors, he's a cut candidate. I mean, the world where anybody is living in that Daniel Bellinger is not a part of this roster and not arguably the number 1 on the depth chart to start the season unless Theo Johnson comes on strong. We couldn't figure it out. We still can't figure it out. Let this unofficial depth chart be your guide. Now, let's go ahead and turn our attention over to, don't need to tell you, Drew Lock's the back of the Daniel Jones, Tommy DeVito. He's fighting for the spot. My goodness, what a battle we have in camp. Let's turn our attention over to the defensive side on what is becoming a seismic OGP Live episode over on YouTube, continuing the unofficial depth chart talk coming up here next. All right, Andy, let's turn our attention over to the defensive side of the football. It is jam-packed. Oh, it's jam-packed. Not a lot of surprises in terms of Brian Burns, Dexter Lawrence, Kayvon Thibodeau, Bobby Okereke, Micah McFadden still listed there. Drew Phillips, rookie, listed right there inside of that nickelback spot. He's going to be there. You have Banks. And then maybe the first one that jumps out at you in terms of just a talking point would be Cordell Flott getting listed at the starting outside cornerback. Now, that's what they said it was going to be coming into camp. So I wouldn't expect them to tear that away from him immediately. But as we know, he's the guy early on here that we've seen. We say, oh, having some struggles. And we've already seen Nick McCloud get some reps on the outside with the first team.
Yeah, not so surprising in any of this. I guess the couple of notes that I thought about the first time I saw this, one is they already told us it's Dane Belton's job to lose. That also was very easy when Tyler Nubin was a little dinged up and injured and a rookie. So like you make sure that you give Dane Belton the opportunity, as we mentioned before about veterans, potentially someone has to come and take it rather than be given it. That was the first thing I thought about. The second thing I thought about is I was kind of shocked to see Drew Phillips be named the first team for the nickel corner. After in Hard Knocks, they talked about Isaiah Simmons coming back as that nickel guy. We know that he probably is more of a situational guy when it comes to that. We have heard everyone rant and rave about how good Nick McCloud has looked in camp, whether it's inside or outside, but he's actually third string nickel corner behind Isaiah Simmons. And we know that the Giants really want Cordell Flott to be able to be that guy on the outside as cornerback number 2. They are giving him every opportunity to say, win this job. If you can find a way to do what you need to do, no one's going to pass you. Those are the quick observations that I had that were kind of like, oh, yep, this is what they told us in camp. And this is kind of what the depth chart looks like now.
Well, how about the fact that is Darnay Holmes getting listed behind Cordell Flott on the depth chart second here? He's listed behind Cordell Flott on the outside. And if we go the deeper layer onto it, when you talk about having a guy like Nick McCloud, he's listed on the inside behind, obviously, Drew Phillips, who gets that starting role, and then also Isaiah Simmons. So you mentioned his name there. He's getting put. It's Drew Phillips' job, but you're going to have Isaiah Simmons get listed. He's the flexible piece. And then Nick McCloud looks like, in totality, I would anticipate Nick McCloud's your primary backup at that spot, and Isaiah Simmons has this float kind of role. I mean, on the one hand, you could say, Darnay Holmes on the outside, that seems crazy. The other way you look at it is, well, we drafted Drew Phillips. He's going to be the starter. Darnay Holmes, if you're looking for a role on this team, as we've said, hey, special teams value, you showed that last year, but we're going to try you different places because if you can't find a role for yourself, you may find yourself not having a role.
Well, I agree in the sense of like, we need you to find a home. And if you're the 5th nickel corner, that's not a home for you. So like,
right. Yeah. You might as well just cut. Let's go. Hey, thanks so much. See you later.
Right. But aren't you surprised? And maybe I shouldn't be, but looking behind Deonte Banks, you have Trey Hawkins. Why is Nick McCloud not listed behind Deonte Banks at the very least? To me, it's like, you're telling me if I keep going back to this. It's like week 1, you have to win a game. Deonte Banks goes down. Trey Hawkins is just going to replace him. You wouldn't put in Nick McCloud or you wouldn't do something else. To me, that seems crazy given what we saw when Trey Hawkins was healthy during the regular season. He almost had a perfect quarterback rating against him in coverage. To me, that was surprising to see that Nick McCloud isn't even listed in the picture that you're talking about, yet he's been one of the better corners in camp so far.
Yeah, I think, yeah. And again, if it's like this camp base, then you start to ask the questions where Nick McCloud fits in and why isn't he listed here or there? If you go on a global level, you say, well, Trey Hawkins, even with the terrible, rating against from quarterbacks last season, but that's what he is. He's an outside cornerback. So you're going to list him there and say, this is your opportunity. And by the way, this is a little bit conflicting because on the one hand, I'm telling you, Trey Hawkins is behind Tay Banks because that's what his role is. Darnay Holmes is listed behind Cordell Flott because he doesn't have a role. He's been kind of worked out of it. And that's what the Isaiah Simmons represents here to me too. It's what Nick McCloud represents too. And if you go in behind this, I'll give you the other one that really jumps out to me. Trey Herndon is dead last on this depth chart right now. It cements what I thought when they brought him in, that this was a camp body, a guy to help in case other players were struggling, make sure you're still getting good reps for wide receivers. I don't see anything terribly different happening there. David Long Jr. still remains a guy that I want to keep an eye on. Let's continue this conversation over the course of the summer. Safety-wise, Jervarius Owens, he's listed there along with Caleb Hayes. Nothing really surprising in terms of having Dane Belt and Jason Pinnock. Elijah Riley gets listed as the first one behind Pinnock. So, backups interesting to watch there. We assume Tyler Nubin, as he gets fully healthy and his legs underneath him, that's going to be a big conversation about the top 3 guys there. Anywhere else, when you look inside the linebacking room or the defensive front, that you go, oh, okay, here's a name that we've heard a little bit about. Is he building up? Is he building up some cachet over the course of camp?
Yeah, I think what I found interesting is when you look at the nose tackle position, you see Dexter Lawrence and you see Jordan Riley. We want Jordan Riley to be the guy that potentially comes in. When you look at the defensive tackle position, Jordan Phillips is listed there at defensive tackle in front of Elijah Chapman, who has been getting a lot of buzz in camp. Casey Rogers isn't even listed on your depth chart. He's behind Elijah Chapman. That's how far the defensive tackle position goes down. But obviously that was a position where we have such strength with Dexter Lawrence, but we need to figure out who else can be a rotational guy behind them, because we have said that it seemed pretty thin given that they brought in a guy like Jordan Phillips. Jordan Riley didn't necessarily ascend the way we were hoping for last year. It will be interesting to see how those names shift behind Nunez Roche and Dexter Lawrence as we get closer to week 1.
Yeah, 100%. And Chapman's been interesting, right? So you're watching him and saying, hey, guess what? Maybe it comes down to, as we know, when we get to the preseason game tomorrow night against the Lions and going forward, sometimes because a lot of the guys on the top of the depth chart don't get a lot of the game reps, that's when some of the deeper cuts get to say, hey, I make a little bit of steam here, carry it over the next week of practice, and start to get real position battles. The last note for me here that I'll bring up at the linebacker spot, inside linebacker, listen, you expect it to be Okereke and McFadden. We've heard positive things about Deontay Johnson. He's listed there. How about Carter Coughlin? How about Carter Coughlin being the first backup behind Bobby Okereke? By the way, he's my little sweetheart pick from years ago. Got that one right. And then I'd have to wait several years for him to really emerge. But he's claimed that first backup role. You go deeper in behind it. Darian Beavers holding out my little hope for him, because right now you've got Adams there, and then you've got the rookie Darius Muasau getting listed ahead of him, at least right now. Again, coming back from injury, etc. But this is where, and we can even extend it to the outside linebacker a little, with Timon Fox being listed as the depth piece, right? You have Thibodeau, there's Ojulari as the backup. This room just seems like we need one different body, potentially, if we don't see some guys cement themselves even as deep cut pieces.
Yeah, I saw Darian Beavers as one of the last people listed, and when you're all the way on the right of the depth chart, it doesn't bode well. Remember, he was cut towards the end last year, and then they kind of re-signed him and brought him back into the fold. He's really going to have to work to be able to get there. Yeah. We thought he had an opportunity to even be a potential starter next to Bobby Okereke at the beginning of the season last year. Now he might not even be able to make the roster. Things have drastically
He's a guy to watch in these preseason games. Like that's one of the names where you go like, hey, right now you are buried. You're going to have to show it. When other guys aren't playing, you're going to have to really pop against other deep backups on other rosters. You got to look like one of the best players on the field potentially to make a move for yourself.
Well, and what'll be fascinating to look at is, remember, this is a completely different defensive scheme. Wink Martindale required certain attributes and skills of players, whereas Shane Bowen's system is a little bit different. It's why Deontay Johnson ran the same exact system when he was at the University of Toledo. We mentioned it in our last episode. He feels extremely comfortable playing that middle linebacking quarterback position when they play quarter defense. Yep. And so, Adam, you're going to see maybe guys that you thought could fight for, backup roles or starting roles even, may not be as good of a fit in Shane Bowen's system, because either they are a one reaction cut kind of guy, or they don't necessarily have the skill to sit back in zone coverage. They're a better tackler. Like, there's a whole host of reasons why these guys may shift around, but it is surprising to see that some guys that were potentially great for a Wink Martindale scheme maybe don't fit Shane Bowen, and vice versa.
Of course, man. So that is why. Woo-hoo-hoo. First unofficial depth chart in the books. There are some things. There's interesting stuff that's going to carry forward in the coming weeks. But when we think about this roster and this team, the one thing that I will say is, as we carry ourselves into the regular season and what the expectations are going to be for this roster, the last note on special teams here, because we talked about wide receiver a lot, we talked about some of these different levels. It's noteworthy that if you think Isaiah McKenzie has a role, right now he's behind Gunner in terms of punt return and kick return. Right now, Darius Slayton is listed as the third man up in that hierarchy. So if you believe Darius Slayton isn't going anywhere, it's just a matter of if he's the third or the fourth, or he's splitting reps there, Well, now all of a sudden, what happens in that wide receiver room? Somebody's going to move up the board. Someone's going to move down. And we continue to come back to Isaiah McKenzie, time in Buffalo. Does he carve out that 6th or 7th spot in the wide receiver room that says, oh, maybe he can get on the field if he needs to, and he also returns the football? I think it's one of the reasons why you saw some Darius Slayton in that mold last year, because the Giants were thinking ahead to, as he slides down the pecking order, can we make sure we maximize value for a player that we're going to be given a little bit of extra money here along the way?
Yeah, it is funny to see the Giants kind of hedge their bet a little bit in special teams. They have Gunnar Olszewski ahead of Isaiah McKenzie in punt return and kick return, but they have Isaiah McKenzie ahead of Gunnar Olszewski in the wide receiver. So they kind of like hedge their bet a little bit, like, hey, whoever provides us the better versatility between the two positions is going to basically win the last roster spot in the wide receiver room. So it'll be fascinating to see. Obviously, they also changed around some of the way that they're doing special teams, obviously, this year with Michael Gabriel as the new special teams coach. It'll be interesting to see. Gunnar Olszewski was here last year, different special teams coach, maybe doesn't have the same affinity for him. Now he goes out and says, whoever's better for the job, just go win it, and that's what it's going to be.
And by the way, different kickoff rules are coming down the pike as well. We saw that in the Hall of Fame game, the setup. Like, does it matter to be this quick little shifty, twitchy return man anymore? Or is it just about reading and reacting to some clear path blocks or having a little more body to you? That's when you get down to Darius Slayton, let's say, of, hey, get the ball in my hands and I'll just try to find a seam and go ahead and hit it. So all fun stuff to keep an eye on here. That wide receiver room is fascinating. We talked about the top 4 guys with a nod to 5 and 6, mostly around special teams. There's a lot of other wide receivers here. Bryce Ford-Wheaton, right? There's a lot of names that maybe are trying to go ahead and give themselves a little bit of spotlight, and that'll start on Thursday night. And as a reminder, Andy, before we get to, I won't even say it. I'll let you say it. A reminder that tomorrow we're going to be having on from the Roar of the Lions UK podcast. Anthony will be on with us. We're going to talk about his takeaways coming out of these joint practices, how it feels from a elite team standpoint, having some of these scrums break out. And then I'll try to solicit some trades and some conversations about cut candidates for the Giants to target. So that'll be Thursday. And then obviously Friday, we come back in with our reactions to preseason and maybe get back into this depth chart and say who's making some hay for themselves.
Absolutely. I'm excited to get the perspective from another team about what's been going on. We've been getting a lot from our end and our perspective. It'll be interesting to hear the other side of the coin. Really exciting stuff. First preseason game. It sounds like Brian Daboll hasn't announced who's going to play yet. It sounds like Daniel Jones unlikely to get any snaps in this game. Dan Campbell has already said that guys like Jared Goff and others are not going to be playing. So you're going to get more opportunities to see probably Tommy DeVito. You're probably going to see a lot of these guys that are fighting for roster spots. Hey, you may even see Darian Beavers get half a game worth to be able to see if he can move up in the pecking order at the linebacking position.
You better believe it, guys. So, I got to tell you, man, that was a lot. That was a lot. I'm feeling pretty good, feeling a little tired, feeling a little sleepy. Got a whole day before we get into that. Obviously, stick around tomorrow for that crossover episode. Get us on YouTube, where we're going live at least once a week. Get us on your podcast feeds. Go over and leave those 5-star reviews on Apple Podcast. It means the world to us, helps to move the needle. Show your support as we show our support for you, showing your support for the New York Football Giants. Until the next time, though. Until the best times, as Andrew Mackowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.